Hello, great people. Welcome to today's edition of Insights with Ezekiel as we continue to make progress with the ongoing series, Making the Most of 2023. Listen to this. To make the most of this year, then we must embrace steady evaluation. Steady evaluation. It means that we must constantly evaluate ourselves. As I began to study about the word evaluation, I found out three synonyms that stuck with me. The first one is the word appraisal. The second one is the word assessment. And the third word is the word analysis. Analysis, assessment, and appraisal. When we study scripture and we get to the book of Haggai, chapter 1, God began to communicate his disappointment to the people through prophet Haggai. At that time, he began to communicate his disappointment, and in Haggai chapter 1 verse 5 and Haggai chapter 1 verse 7, God told them through prophet Haggai, consider your ways. In verse 5, by the time we get to verse 7 of Haggai chapter 1, it said to them again, consider your ways. In other words, you too analyze yourself. In other words, you too appraise yourself. In other words, you too assess yourself. If we are going to make the most of this year, then we must constantly examine ourselves. We must not get to a point where we become too busy to evaluate ourselves. We must not get to a point where we become too busy to appraise ourselves. From time to time, we must sit down to evaluate ourselves. What exactly do we evaluate? What exactly do we examine? We ought to evaluate our decisions from time to time. We ought to evaluate our action from time to time. We ought to evaluate our behavior from time to time. We ought to be able to sit down and see if we are making progress in line with our God's given vision, plan, God's given vision, and God's given purpose. This is so important. We must embrace steady evaluation. At the end of a week, you need to sit down and evaluate that week. At the end of a month, you need to sit down and evaluate that month. At the end of a quarter, you need to sit down and evaluate that quarter. You need to sit down and evaluate aspects of your life. This is so important. This is how we will make the most of 2023, by giving ourselves to steady evaluation, by assessing ourselves every once and again, by appraising ourselves every once and again, by running an analysis on our decisions every once and again. We must examine ourselves. We must evaluate ourselves. This is so important. We must. It's a must. It's a must. We make the most of the year by steadily, constantly, every once and again, examining our days, our weeks, and our months that will eventually culminate into a year. Never forget that to make the most of this year, you should steadily evaluate ourselves. Have an